8 men dead in 4 hours. That was the cost when conventional recon units tried copying SOG's secret infiltration routes during the Vietnam War. Lieutenant Mark Brennan knew something was wrong the moment his patrol entered the jungle corridor along the Laotian border. 3 weeks earlier, a MACV-SOG team had used this exact route and vanished into the dense vegetation like ghosts. Ranger 6 had been walking for 4 hours and already left a trail obvious enough for a child to follow. Broken branches, disturbed soil, boot prints pressed deep into the mud. Every mistake screamed their presence to anyone watching, and someone was always watching. The ambush erupted at dawn. AK-47 fire tore through the canopy from 3 directions simultaneously. Brennan's radio operator went down first, blood spreading across his chest before he could call for extraction. The patrol scattered, but the North Vietnamese Army soldiers had positioned themselves perfectly. They knew exactly where the Americans would be. By the time helicopter gunships arrived 2 hours later, 8 men were dead, 4 were wounded, and military commanders in Saigon were asking a question that should have been asked months earlier. Why could SOG do what conventional units couldn't? The answer would cost dozens more lives before anyone listened. MACV-SOG was created in January 1964 as the most classified special operations unit in American military history. The Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, operated under such deep cover that most military personnel didn't know it existed. The innocuous name was deliberate misdirection. SOG wasn't studying anything. They were conducting strategic reconnaissance, sabotage, and psychological operations in areas where American forces legally couldn't operate. Laos, Cambodia, North Vietnam itself. Places where international agreements and political considerations prevented conventional military action. The numbers tell part of the story. SOG never comprised more than 2% of American personnel in Vietnam. Yet they generated 90% of actionable intelligence on North Vietnamese Army movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Small teams, usually 3 American Special Forces operators and 9 indigenous fighters, penetrated hundreds of kilometers into denied territory. They mapped enemy base camps, called in airstrikes, captured prisoners, and disappeared before the enemy knew they were there. Their casualty rate was staggering. 100% of SOG operators were killed or wounded during their tour. But their effectiveness was undeniable. What made SOG different wasn't just courage or equipment, it was an entirely different operational philosophy built over years of trial and error in the most hostile environment imaginable. Selection alone eliminated 90% of volunteers. Those who made it through faced months of specialized training before their first mission. They learned indigenous languages, Montagnard dialects, Nung, Khmer. They studied enemy tactics until they could think like North Vietnamese trackers. They practiced movement techniques that left no trace. Silent walking, irregular patterns that confused enemy scouts, scent discipline that prevented tracker dogs from following them. The routes themselves represented years of accumulated knowledge. SOG teams didn't just find paths through the jungle. They created entire infiltration systems based on terrain features that didn't appear on any map. A particular rock formation that provided cover from observation. A stream bed that masked sound and scent. A ridgeline that offered escape routes in 3 directions. Each route had specific protocols, optimal weather conditions, moon phases that provided enough light to move but not enough to be seen. Times when enemy patrols changed shifts. This wasn't information you could learn from a briefing. It was knowledge earned through hundreds of missions and paid for in blood. Indigenous integration was critical. SOG operators didn't just work with Montagnard, Nung, and Khmer fighters. They lived with them, ate with them, learned their customs, and earned their trust. These indigenous soldiers knew the jungle in ways Americans never could. They could read signs in the forest that were invisible to outsiders. They understood the rhythms of the land, when to move, when to freeze, when danger was near. Without them, SOG operations would have been impossible. The patience doctrine separated SOG from every other American unit in Vietnam. Conventional forces moved quickly, seeking contact with the enemy. SOG teams could remain motionless for 16 hours, watching a single trail junction. They understood that in denied territory, the first side to move often lost. They would spend days covering distances conventional units crossed in hours. Every step was calculated, every sound analyzed, every decision weighed against the risk of detection. By late 1967, SOG's success created pressure from an unexpected direction. Division commanders throughout Vietnam were frustrated by their inability to track North Vietnamese movements. Conventional reconnaissance units, including elite long-range reconnaissance patrols, achieved limited success. They could operate near American bases and in relatively secure areas. But the critical intelligence came from deep in denied territory, from the Ho Chi Minh Trail Network, from enemy base areas in Laos and Cambodia, from places only SOG could reach. The logic seemed sound. If SOG methods worked so well, why not teach them to more units? Why not multiply the intelligence-gathering capability by training conventional recon teams in SOG techniques? The potential for force multiplication was enormous. Instead of a handful of SOG teams, dozens of conventional units could penetrate denied areas. The intelligence windfall would be massive. Multiple division commanders formally requested access to SOG routes and operational techniques. MACV leadership saw the strategic potential. More intelligence meant better targeting. Better targeting meant more effective operations. More effective operations meant winning the war faster. The math was simple. The reality would prove far more complex. SOG commanders expressed serious reservations. Their concerns were dismissed as territorial behavior, elite units protecting their mystique, refusing to share knowledge that could help the broader war effort. The criticism stung because it was fundamentally wrong. SOG operators weren't protecting their reputation. They were trying to prevent a catastrophe they could see coming. They understood something that conventional commanders didn't. Their techniques weren't tactics that could be taught in a classroom. They were an operational philosophy that required complete transformation of how soldiers thought about warfare. The compromise satisfied no one. Selected conventional reconnaissance units would receive access to certain SOG routes, along with basic training in infiltration techniques. The training would be compressed from months to weeks due to operational demands. SOG instructors would provide familiarization with key concepts. Conventional units would attempt missions in less critical areas first. If successful, access would expand. The warning signs appeared immediately. SOG instructors watched conventional soldiers practice movement techniques and saw fundamental problems. These were good soldiers, brave, well-trained in conventional tactics. But they lacked the instincts that kept SOG teams alive in denied territory. They moved too quickly, made too much noise, left obvious trails. When instructors pointed out mistakes, the soldiers corrected them. But correction wasn't the same as instinct. In combat, you didn't have time to think about every step. Your body had to know automatically. Indigenous fighters refused to accompany conventional units. When asked why, they gave vague answers. Bad feeling, wrong spirit. SOG operators understood. The indigenous soldiers could sense that conventional troops didn't have the patience or cultural understanding necessary for deep penetration missions. They knew these missions would fail. They weren't willing to die proving it. The first attempts came in early 1968 with SOG teams shepherding conventional units on relatively simple infiltration missions. The results were discouraging. Conventional teams struggled with basic fieldcraft. They were too loud, talked too much, moved too fast, created obvious disturbances in the vegetation. SOG teams found themselves constantly stopping to correct mistakes. Several missions had to be aborted when conventional units compromised the operation through noise or visible trail signs. Tension between elite and conventional forces grew. SOG operators felt conventional soldiers weren't taking the training seriously. Conventional soldiers felt SOG was being deliberately unhelpful. Then the disasters began. Operation Cedar Falls Extension launched in March 1968. A long-range reconnaissance patrol from the 1st Infantry Division, attempted to use a SOG infiltration route into Cambodia to observe a suspected North Vietnamese Army logistics hub. The mission planning revealed the first critical mistakes. The helicopter insertion landed too close to the target area. SOG doctrine required walking 20 kilometers from the landing zone to avoid connecting the helicopter noise with the team's location. The conventional unit wanted to save time. They inserted just 5 kilometers away. The team size was wrong. 12 men. SOG used 3 to 4 Americans for this particular route because larger groups were impossible to move silently through the dense vegetation. The conventional commanders wanted more firepower for security. They didn't understand that in denied territory, security came from not being detected. Once the enemy knew you were there, no amount of firepower would save you. They carried standard rations. SOG used specialized low-scent food because North Vietnamese soldiers and tracker dogs could smell American rations from hundreds of meters away. The conventional unit didn't know this. No one told them. They moved during daylight on established game trails because it was easier than cutting through dense jungle. SOG moved at night and created their own paths, specifically to avoid areas where the enemy might be watching. The North Vietnamese detected them within 6 hours. The ambush came 6 hours after that, at a stream crossing where the team was most vulnerable. 7 men died in the initial volley. 3 were wounded. The emergency extraction required 4 helicopters and close air support. The noise and activity compromised SOG operations in that area for months. North Vietnamese forces now knew Americans were using that infiltration corridor. They increased patrols and set up observation posts. A route that had taken 2 years to develop became useless overnight. The A Shau Valley incident in June 1968 was worse. A reconnaissance platoon from the 101st Airborne Division used a SOG route to approach a suspected enemy headquarters complex. The critical failure was the lack of indigenous guides who knew local North Vietnamese patrol patterns. SOG teams relied on this knowledge to avoid enemy forces. The conventional unit had maps and compass bearings. They thought that was enough. They walked directly into a North Vietnamese Army base camp that wasn't on any map. SOG knew it was there. Their indigenous fighters had reported it months earlier. But that intelligence was classified at a level the conventional unit couldn't access. The entire 8-man team was killed. Their bodies were recovered 3 days later. The after-action investigation revealed the tragedy. The information that could have saved them existed. They just weren't cleared to receive it. The route package disaster in August 1968 demonstrated how quickly things could cascade out of control. 3 conventional teams attempted coordinated infiltration using different SOG routes in the tri-border area where Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam met. The plan was ambitious. Multiple teams gathering intelligence simultaneously across a wide area. The execution was catastrophic. The first team was detected within hours. They broke radio silence to report contact. The second team heard the radio traffic and panicked. They called for immediate extraction, convinced the enemy knew they were there too. The third team was compromised by the helicopter activity from the first 2 extractions. North Vietnamese forces now knew all 3 routes were active. They launched a systematic sweep of the entire area. SOG was forced to abandon a route network that had taken 2 years to develop. 15 Americans died in the operation and subsequent enemy sweeps. Dozens of indigenous fighters were killed when North Vietnamese forces raided their villages, suspecting collaboration with American forces. The intelligence value gained was 0. The strategic cost was immense. A pattern emerged from the failures. Conventional units lacked capabilities that SOG had spent years developing. They didn't conduct sufficient pre-mission intelligence gathering. SOG teams spent weeks studying target areas before insertion. They analyzed enemy patrol patterns, identified water sources where enemy soldiers would congregate, located observation posts and base camps. Conventional units received standard intelligence briefings and maps that were often months out of date. Cultural and linguistic integration was absent. SOG operators spoke indigenous languages and worked as equals with their indigenous teammates. Conventional military culture maintained clear hierarchy and separation. Indigenous fighters could sense the difference. They knew conventional soldiers saw them as subordinates rather than partners. That fundamental disconnect made effective cooperation impossible. Patience was lacking. Conventional units were trained to move with purpose and seek contact with the enemy. SOG doctrine emphasized the opposite. Move slowly, avoid contact, gather intelligence and escape without the enemy knowing you were ever there. This required a completely different mindset that couldn't be taught in a few weeks of training. Understanding of North Vietnamese tracking methods was superficial. SOG operators studied how enemy trackers worked. They knew what signs trackers looked for. They understood how to create false trails and use terrain to break their scent trail. Conventional soldiers knew basic counter-tracking techniques from training manuals. In practice, against experienced North Vietnamese trackers, that knowledge was inadequate. The human cost was staggering. Conventional units attempting SOG routes suffered casualty rates 300% higher than their normal reconnaissance operations. Families received notifications that their sons or husbands had been killed in action. They were never told the real reason. The missions remained classified for decades. The soldiers died trying to do something they weren't trained or equipped to do, because commanders believed elite capabilities could be mass-produced on demand. The operational impact extended beyond the immediate casualties. SOG was forced to restrict access to route information and operational techniques. Conventional commanders accused them of being uncooperative and elitist. The accusations were painful because they missed the point entirely. Every compromised route cost months of work and lives. SOG wasn't protecting their reputation. They were protecting soldiers and preserving capabilities that took years to build. North Vietnamese intelligence began documenting American infiltration patterns. This was new. SOG had operated for years without the enemy understanding their methods. Now, because conventional units left obvious trails and used predictable tactics, the North Vietnamese started to recognize infiltration attempts. They increased security along previously vulnerable corridors. They set up ambush positions at likely helicopter landing zones. They deployed tracker teams specifically to hunt American reconnaissance units. Intelligence gathering in critical areas dropped by 40% over a 6-month period. The irony was brutal. The attempt to increase intelligence capability by expanding access to SOG methods actually decreased overall effectiveness. The strategic setback would take years to overcome. The psychological toll affected everyone involved. SOG operators felt responsible for conventional unit deaths. They had warned that this would happen. They had tried to explain why the training was insufficient. Nobody listened until the body bags came home. Every casualty report felt like a personal failure. They knew those soldiers died because commanders didn't understand the difference between tactics and philosophy. Conventional reconnaissance soldiers developed complicated feelings about SOG, envy mixed with resentment. They knew SOG operators were extraordinarily skilled. They respected that. But they also felt set up to fail, given missions they weren't prepared for with training that was inadequate. Told they could do what SOG did, then blamed when they couldn't. Policy changes came in late 1968. MACV finally restricted access to SOG routes and operational methods. New protocols required extensive vetting before any cross-training occurred. The damage was already done. Several key infiltration networks were permanently compromised. The intelligence gap would never be fully recovered. The fundamental misunderstanding was philosophical. Military leadership believed SOG techniques were tactics that could be taught quickly. Take a good soldier, show them how SOG moves through the jungle, teach them the routes, send them on missions. The reality was completely different. SOG methods were an entire operational philosophy requiring cultural transformation. It was like trying to teach someone to play piano by showing them sheet music. The mechanics were visible. The mastery required years. The training gap was enormous. SOG selection took 6 to 12 months of specialized training before operators went on their first mission. Conventional units received 2 to 3 weeks of familiarization training before attempting the same missions. Critical elements were missing. Indigenous language training. SOG operators spent months learning Montagnard dialects. cultural immersion with local fighters, extensive map study and terrain familiarization, psychological preparation for the isolation and extreme stress of operating deep in enemy territory. Equipment differences mattered more than anyone acknowledged. SOG used specialized gear developed specifically for denied area operations, suppressed weapons that reduced noise signature, custom rations that minimized scent, modified radios with better range and encryption, sterile weapons without U.S. markings for deniability. Conventional units used standard issue equipment designed for different types of operations. Their M16 rifles immediately identified them as Americans. Their radios had limited range in the dense jungle. Their equipment wasn't designed for the missions they were attempting. The intelligence problem was structural. SOG had access to highly classified intelligence sources that conventional units couldn't access due to clearance levels. SOG knew enemy positions, patrol patterns, and base locations that never appeared in standard intelligence briefings. Conventional units operated with incomplete information. They were sent into areas where the enemy was present without knowing exactly where or in what strength. The information gap alone made their missions exponentially more dangerous. The cultural barrier was insurmountable with short training timelines. SOG integrated with indigenous forces as equals and partners. They lived in indigenous villages, participated in local ceremonies, learned customs, and showed respect. Conventional military culture maintained clear hierarchy and separation. Indigenous fighters could sense the difference immediately. They knew conventional soldiers saw them as subordinates. That fundamental disconnect prevented the trust necessary for effective operations. A few conventional units did successfully adopt SOG methods. The difference was commitment. The 75th Ranger Regiment Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol companies that underwent extended SOG training spent 3 to 6 months in the training pipeline instead of 2 to 3 weeks. They integrated indigenous fighters into their teams from the beginning. They adopted SOG philosophy rather than just copying tactics. They were willing to abandon conventional military culture and transform into something different. Leadership made the difference. Commanders who understood the commitment required, who recognized that creating elite capabilities required elite investment, who gave their soldiers time to develop skills rather than rushing them into operations. These units achieved success rates comparable to SOG. Their casualty rates were 80% lower than conventional units with minimal training. The lesson was clear. Elite capabilities require elite commitment. Shortcuts lead to casualties. You cannot mass-produce excellence. The soldiers who succeeded didn't try to copy SOG. They transformed into something similar through proper development and respect for what the mission required. The immediate aftermath from 1969 to 1971 saw SOG continue operations with restricted access to their methods. Conventional reconnaissance units returned to standard procedures. The experiment was quietly abandoned. No official acknowledgement of failure. No public discussion of the casualties. The missions remained classified for decades. Institutional learning eventually occurred. The military began to understand that special operations require special selection, training, and support systems. The seeds were planted for modern special operations command structure. The recognition that elite units cannot be mass-produced became doctrine. The price of that lesson was measured in lives. Modern applications show the lessons were partially learned. Post-Vietnam military reforms incorporated understanding that special operations required dedicated pipelines, selection courses that eliminate candidates who lack necessary attributes, training programs that take years rather than weeks, support structures designed specifically for special operations rather than adapted from conventional forces. The entire system has to be different from day one. But some lessons remain unlearned. Similar mistakes were repeated in Iraq and Afghanistan. Conventional units attempting to replicate special operations methods without proper preparation. Institutional pressure for force multiplication leading to shortcuts that cost lives. The pattern persists because the temptation is always there. Elite units achieve remarkable results. Commanders want to expand those capabilities quickly. The pressure to take shortcuts remains constant. The human legacy endures. Veterans of the failed operations carry psychological scars. Survivors struggle with memories of watching teammates die in missions they weren't prepared for. SOG veterans live with guilt over conventional unit casualties. They tried to prevent the disasters. They warned that insufficient training would lead to deaths. Nobody listened until it was too late. Families still don't know the full story of how their loved ones died. The missions remained classified for decades. Even now, many details are restricted. The soldiers died attempting something they weren't trained or equipped to do. They died because commanders believed elite capabilities could be created on demand. They died proving that belief was wrong. The core message transcends military operations. Elite capabilities exist for a reason. They require elite selection, training, and support. Attempting to shortcut the process doesn't democratize excellence. It creates casualties. The paradox is painful. Trying to expand SOG's capabilities actually reduced them. Compromised routes meant less intelligence. Higher casualties meant fewer volunteers. The attempt to multiply effectiveness divided it instead. The timeless lesson applies beyond warfare. In any field, mastery requires commitment. Techniques without philosophy are just movements. You can copy what someone does without understanding why they do it. The difference between mechanics and mastery is measured in years of dedicated practice. There are no shortcuts. The belief that you can skip steps and achieve the same results is seductive. It's also wrong. The soldiers who died attempting SOG missions weren't failures. They were victims of institutional hubris. Commanders who believed that elite capabilities could be mass-produced. Leaders who thought that good soldiers with brief training could do what took years to develop. The soldiers did their best with inadequate preparation. They paid with their lives for decisions made far above their level. Their sacrifice eventually led to better understanding. Modern special operations forces exist because the military learned from Vietnam. Selection is rigorous. Training takes years. Support systems are designed specifically for special operations requirements. Elite units remain elite with proper pipelines that maintain standards. The lesson cost lives to learn, but it was learned. Lieutenant Mark Brennan's patrol wasn't the last conventional unit to die attempting SOG missions, but the pattern of failures eventually forced change. 300 meters away, hidden in dense vegetation, a SOG reconnaissance team observed the ambush through binoculars. They couldn't intervene without compromising their own mission. They watched Ranger 6 get destroyed, knowing that every death proved what they had been saying all along. Some things cannot be copied. They can only be earned through years of blood, sweat, and jungle silence. If you're not subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button to dive deeper into untold military history. Drop a like if this story opened your eyes, and leave a comment below. What other secret operations should we uncover next?